Hi everybody, Joseph here. Welcome to Bean to Bar World. Today I'm going to talk about sourness or tartness in your fine bean to bar chocolate. Whether you're making bean to bar chocolate or consuming bean to bar chocolate, tartness and sourness is something that we definitely need to pay attention to. So let's get started. So for those of you who are new to the fine chocolate world, you have realized that there are some fine chocolate bars out there that have a level of sourness or tartness to them. Now personally, I prefer to use the word, just for my own sake, I use sour in a negative way when it comes to chocolate and tart in a good way. Tart usually means it's not too sour, it's got a little bit of that in there, and it enhances the flavors of the bar, whereas sour is usually like vinegar, not very good. So if you're new to bean to bar chocolate, you may have come across origins and bars specifically that have a tartness to them. So for instance, here I have a Maguire Tanzania bar, Coco Camilli. A lot of Tanzania origin bars tend to have a bit of that tartness in there. We have a Papua New Guinea origin by Kazama, also has a little bit of tartness in there. We have a Morapon bar by Kontu, definitely has tartness in there. And we have a Madagascar bar from Pump Street, which also, usually a lot of Madagascar origins have tartness as well. A lot of Peru origins have fruity tartness as well, but not all. So tart and fruitiness is something that gets associated together in fine chocolate. But keep in mind that just because a chocolate has a level of tartness doesn't necessarily mean that there's fruity notes in there. Okay. Now all these bars that I just showed you have a good level of tartness. Some people might say for their preference it's a little bit too tart, they find it sour if you're a beginner, but I would say that these are favorable levels of tartness in your fine chocolate, which actually really enhance the fruity notes in those bars. Now sometimes it makes our mind perceive fruitiness when it's not really there, because we associate tart and sweet together with fruit. That's where our brain goes. But nevertheless, these bars have a favorable amount of tartness. Now these bars do not. This is a Granada origin from Pump Street as well. They say, and some people say, that there's a little bit of fruitiness in there. It's quite minimal. It's quite minimal. For a lot of people, they don't get that at all, and I wouldn't say it's tart at all. The Solstice Tranquilidad bar, Bolivia origin, definitely not fruity notes and very, very little if no tartness in there as well. The Louisa brand bar, the Purist bar, there might be some fruity flavors, but not tart at all. So you don't have to have tartness in fine chocolate. A lot of people, when they're introduced to it, a lot of makers, when they're making the origin, it's that tartness, that fruitiness that kind of stands out against from the commercial chocolate. So a lot of bean to bar makers, curators tend to focus on those a lot, and a lot of beginners usually tend to like that because it's so different. But fine chocolate doesn't have to be tart. It can be tart with fruity notes, it can be tart without fruity notes, or it can be not tart at all with fruity notes or without fruity notes. Okay, so keep in mind though, there are some bars out there that are sour, and there are some origins that are consistently never sour, never tart. But there are some brands out there that regardless of the origin, it's sour. And that's not a favorable component of chocolate or fine chocolate especially. So in the commercial chocolate world, they try to avoid all tartness, all sourness. And we'll talk about sort of where that comes from. But a little bit is actually quite pleasant. If you think about foods and cuisines mixing tartness, for instance, papaya salad, you have different elements in there. Filipino adobo has different elements of tart and sweet and salty. So you can add tartness to foods, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's times where things are too sour. Maybe you went to a sort of a fast food, Asian, Chinese restaurant, and they kind of overdo it with the sugars and the vinegars and the salts, and everything's just like too vinegary and too sugar. That's not good, right? Just a well-balanced, a little bit of that vinegar in there can enhance the food. Too much, it becomes sour. It's not very pleasurable. And this is coming from someone who actually enjoys sour foods. I love fermented foods that have that tartness to there. And I like, when I was a kid, I used to like sour candies. So I'm not opposed to sourness, but when it comes to fine food, when it comes to fine chocolate, there is a level of how much there should be in there. And if your chocolate bar is so sour that it makes your mouth pucker, it starts to salivate, and it burns your throat, it's like you drank a little bit of vinegar, that's not a high quality fine chocolate, I'm sorry to say. There are some brands out there that purposely, maybe under roast, which can allow for the chocolate to be very sour. That might be your niche, that might be your thing. That's just not usually a sign of a high quality chocolate. And I remember doing a tasting recently, not too long ago, and one of the ladies in the tasting, we were talking about the chocolates we were trying, and some of them were probably some of these that had fruity notes but not too sour. And she mentioned that she went to a chocolate maker that I know of that always produces really sour chocolate. She went on the tour there, and she associated that with fine chocolate. That was one of her first experiences with fine chocolate. And she didn't like it, and she was kind of embarrassed to say that she didn't like it, until I told them about how there are some fine chocolate makers out there who have very sour chocolate, and that's not a quality you want. And she started to feel a bit more better about her opinions, because she thought, I'm a beginner, what do I know about chocolate? If it was super sour, maybe that's how it's supposed to taste. Maybe I don't have a refined palate. No. So don't be afraid to be honest about the fine chocolates that you don't like, regardless of how well popular they are, how many awards they win. There's many reasons why certain businesses succeed, and it's not always based on skill set and quality, okay? So, where does sourness in chocolate come from? It comes from many different components. So when we ferment the cocoa pod, so here's a cocoa pod, we open it up, it's not a real one, and there's the fruit inside, and the fruits and the seeds together get fermented. And the reason why we ferment our seeds and our cocoa beans is to reduce the tannins, the very harsh, astringent and tannic and bitter elements of the cocoa bean, which are usually quite natural in cocoa beans, even fine cocoa beans before they're fermented, before they're roasted. They can be not very pleasant. There is some research out there that suggests that there are beans that barely need to be fermented, barely need to be roasted, but that's very rare, and I'll talk about that another day. The fruit and the seeds together get fermented, and it's that fermentation that builds up the acidity. How? The lactic acid and acidic acid bacteria that help with the fermentation, they release acids, they release acidity, and the fermentation is very important, not only for reducing unfavorable bitter, alkaloid, tannic, astringent compounds, but it also breaks down elements in the seed that later on will create wonderful aromas in the chocolate. So if the beans were not fermented, the carbohydrates and proteins in there are not going to be broken down to amino acids and reducing sugars. And if that doesn't happen, then when they're roasted, those reducing sugars and carbohydrates are not going to be there, not going to be there in the right amounts, and the aroma compounds aren't going to be formed because they're formed by those broken down smaller molecule carbohydrates and proteins. And so the fermentation breaks down those components. So fermentation is usually very important for flavor development, but one side effect is that it does increase the acidity in the bean. Now, there's other things before fermentation that also might allow for acidity. So for instance, a lot of people don't know that the flavor of the fruit is important. So if you went to, let's say, Ivory Coast, and you're tasting those bulk commercial cocoa pods, the fruit from those pods, they're not going to taste very good usually. They're going to be much more sour, maybe a bit more bland. The fruit isn't going to be very wonderful. So there's much to be said about the fruit, and there's not a lot talk about that, but it's starting to get out there. So if the fruit is very flavorful, the beans tend to be a bit more flavorful. Sometimes that's not the whole story, but it can impart more favorable aromas to the beans while they ferment. So if the fruit itself is very, very sour, that's going to impact the bean at a certain point. What farmers and growers do before the seeds are fermented is very important as well. So there are many farmers, many growers who will precondition the cocoa pods. They might pick the cocoa pods off the tree, let them stay for a while, and some of the enzymes will start to break down components of the fruit in the pod before it's fermented. And they say that this will help reduce acidity later on during fermentation. There's many growers out there that press the fruit. So the fruit and the seeds kind of are hand in hand, and they'll press that to squeeze a lot of the juice out, because it's the sugars in the juice that will feed the bacteria to create the acid. And if you have too much, they say that it will cause too much acidity in there as well. Not everyone does that, but that's definitely one feature that some growers will do, is they'll squeeze out a lot of the juice before they ferment the cacao. And then that's specifically usually to, they say, enhance the flavor overall, but specifically to reduce the acidity in the beans. So the acidity is built up during the fermentation. There's some things you can do before that to maybe reduce how acidic they become during the fermentation. Proper fermentation can also alter, the degree and quantity of how much acidity is built up. So that has to be done properly as well. And then after the seeds are fermented, when all the fruit melts away, they're dried. And if they're dried too quickly, the acids that are between the thin shell of the cocoa bean and the kernel will kind of harden up and won't allow the acid volatiles that are more in the kernel and the seed to evaporate. And so it kind of locks in the acidity, which is not very good. So that's why drying has to be done properly. If it's done too quickly, usually it's done, within 5, 6, 7 days, the drying. And if it's done really, really quickly, if you, oven dry, artificially dry your beans and you dry them too quickly, it's going to lock in a lot of that acidity. Now, these are things that are done usually at the point of origin of where the cacao is grown. That's not something most chocolate makers have control over unless they live in a climate where they can grow their own cocoa trees, and they are growing their own cocoa trees. Now, for most chocolate makers, it comes to the point of roasting and refining. So when you roast the cocoa beans after they've been dried, it will reduce the acidity a great deal. So if you're having issues in your own bean to bar chocolate with a lot of acidity, it's usually that you're not roasting your beans enough. So I'll talk about roasting more another day, but generally, if you have a surface temperature in your bean of about 250 to 260 degrees Fahrenheit, that's usually a pretty good roast for a cocoa bean, okay? And a lot of people will usually under roast the beans because they kind of want to keep the natural flavors. Well, what does that mean, the natural flavors? The natural flavor of the cocoa bean, a fresh cocoa bean out of a pod is terrible. It's not usually very good. That's why we ferment them. That's why we roast them, to bring out better flavors. Think of it sort of like baking bread, right? Or cooking meat. It's that cooking, it's that roasting, it's those Maillard reactions that build the aromas, that there's the caramelization as well, and that builds aromas and flavors in our foods. So, think of coffee beans too. Most coffee beans are roasted. That's what develops the flavor. And the roasting in cocoa beans will reduce that acidity to a point. I mean, if the beans were too acidic to begin with and were dried properly, there's only so much the roasting will do. It will reduce that acidity, but maybe you have very acidic beans anywhere. That's not usually the case if you have a good source of cocoa bean. So you want to roast the beans properly, usually 250 to 260 Fahrenheit, 20 to 30 minutes. It depends. It varies. Some people will say that's not right at all. It depends, but that's a good ballpark to start. Also, the refining. A lot of people under refine their chocolate. They grind it for 12 hours. If you're doing a tiny micro batch, then maybe that, 12 hours is not too much of a big deal. But usually you want to refine your chocolate if you're using those tabletop refiners, and even a large floor model. You usually want to refine the chocolate for at least 48 hours, 2 days nonstop grinding, because not only does that help develop the flavors, which I'll talk more on another day, but especially in the first 6, 12 hours, it really reduces the acidity. Some research papers say it's maybe a bit less, but it does in the first few hours. The acidic volatiles, which are usually very small. As the chocolate grinds up, as it moves, as it aerates, those acidic aromas will evaporate out of the chocolate mixture in the refiner. And there's a couple things you can play around with. This is a bit more anecdotal, but if you refine with the lid on, that kind of keeps those acids in there. So if you are working with a bean that you find a bit too acidic, then you can lift off the lid in the first 3 hours, 6 hours, and just kind of let that evaporate out of the chocolate, and then maybe put the lid back on as well. Something to keep in mind too as well is when you add the sugar. Now, there is research out there, you can look on my research blog, where as the grinder grinds up the sugar particles with the cocoa butter and the cocoa particles, the sugar particles begin to absorb whatever flavors are around them. That's why a nice, well-refined finished chocolate will have a more homogeneous taste than an unrefined one, where you get these kind of little bits of sugar and these pops of sweetness, and the sugar tastes more like sugar, like plain sugar, than it does of the chocolate. But if it's refined properly, those sugar particles will get smaller, but they'll also absorb the aromas from the butter and the cocoa solids. So if you're adding your sugar too soon and you have a very acidic chocolate, you might want to consider maybe letting that acidity evaporate first before you add your sugar, so that it doesn't cling on to more of those acidic volatiles. Something to consider, something to try if you're having issues with that. And just overall refining time. If you find that the chocolate is very acidic, a bit more of a longer refining time can reduce that acidity. But after the chocolate's done, there's only so long you can refine your chocolate, and maybe you don't want to refine it more than 48 hours, because you might lose some of those notes that is being built up during the refining time. Then aging it might kind of reduce that tartness a little bit. Usually aging is more for, I'll talk about that another day again, but more for very astringent, very harsh flavors. But acidity can be a bit harsh, and you might find that aging might mute the tartness a little bit. I don't find it helps as much with the tartness as it does for other components, but you might want to try that. And what that means is it just, you pour out your chocolate from the machine that's finished. You can pour it on a tray, break it up, put it in a resealable bag, a resealable container, a Cambro. You can create a block of untempered chocolate from the machine, and then once it's set, wrap it up with just paper, newsprint. Keep it in a room that doesn't have a lot of moisture, that's very dry, very cool, doesn't have a lot of odors, and you just let it rest for a few weeks, a few months, and you'll notice that the flavors will change a bit. But again, I'll talk more about that another time. And again, a little bit of tartness can go a long way. If you have what you feel are fruity notes in your chocolate, a little bit of that tartness can enhance it, can actually really add to the experience. Even if it's not fruity either, that acidity can help push the idea of, like espresso or yogurt or things like that, which are flavors that can be very pleasurable. When you're making food, chocolate, dark chocolate is just ground up cocoa beans and sugar, right? But you're still playing around with elements of not just flavor, but taste, bitterness, sweetness, sourness. And playing around with those components can really enhance the experience of a consumer. That's why there's other meals out there, like in Sicily, we make caponata, which is sort of an antipasto, and it has, tomatoes and vegetables and raisins, and it has elements of saltiness, sweetness, and sourness, and just those combinations really excite the palate. So sometimes, if done properly in the right amounts, a little bit of sweetness in the bar, a little bit of that tartness can really just make the bar that much more brighter and more interesting, and maybe allow the consumer to allow their brain to kind of go into different areas of what it might taste like. Fruits, stone fruits, pineapple, yogurt, espresso. That some espressos have a bit of a tartness as well. So something to consider. Hopefully this has helped you. If you want to learn more about Bean to Bar chocolate, check out Bean to Bar World, check out my free academy. There's tons of information there. If there's specific topics you want me to go deeper into, then please go to beantobarworld.com/suggestions and suggest video topics, research summary topics, things like that. And it gives me more of a push to put that out there. So don't be afraid to send me those messages. So it was nice to spend some time with you today talking about sourness and tartness in chocolate, and hope to talk to you again soon.